However, the number of infections was at least 10 times higher because most mild and asymptomatic cases had not been sought and detected. This would bring us to a much more realistic fatality rate of 0.4%. Moreover, the number of true COVID-19 deaths was lower because many or most had died of causes other than the virus. Further correction of the numbers brings us to a rough estimate of 0.1% to 0.3%, which is in the range of moderate flu. This tallies well with the results of Professor Strick, who had arrived at an estimate of 0.24% to 0.25% based on the data in his Heinsberg study. The average age of the deceased who tested positive was around 81 years of age. The conclusion that COVID-19 is comparable to seasonal flu had been reached by many investigators in other countries. In an analysis of several studies, Ioannidis showed that contingent of local factors and statistical methodology, the median infection fatality rate was 0.27%. Many other investigators arrived at similar conclusions. All studies to date thus clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a real killer virus. Flu and COVID-19, who are the vulnerable? So influenza viruses are dangerous, mainly to individuals of 60 years, but can sometimes also cause fatal infection in younger people. A salient feature of the virus is that after its multiplication and release, it induces the infected host cells to commit suicide. This is a major predisposing factor for bacterial superinfections, which were the major cause of death during the Spanish flu. In contrast, viruses are inherently less destructive. Patients show characteristic changes in their lungs, but whether the virus is deadly or not depends less on the virus and more on the patient overall state of health. Time and again, press reports appear on completely healthy young people who nonetheless were carried off by the virus. We do not know of a single case where it did not turn out afterwards that the person had not been completely healthy, but rather had suffered for years with hypertension, diabetes or other illnesses that had gone undetected. Sensational news: a 103-year-old Italian woman recovers from COVID-19. In fact, she was not the only old lady who survived the infection without a problem. Most actually did. The record is held by a 113-year-old Spanish woman. Although the median age of the deceased is over 80 in Germany and other countries, age per se is not the decisive criteria. People without severe existing illnesses need fear the virus no more than young people. As we know from Puschel's and many other reports, SARS-CoV-2 is almost always the last straw that breaks the camel's back. While this is certainly sad for the families and loved ones, it is still no reason as to assign the virus any heightened role. We need to keep in mind that every year millions die of respiratory tract infections and a whole spectrum of bacterial and viral agents playing causal roles. One must not forget that the true cause of death is the disease or condition that triggers the lethal chain of events. If someone's suffering from severe emphysema or end-stage cancer contracts fatal pneumonia, the cause of death is still emphysema or cancer. This basic rule is simply ignored in times of coronavirus. Even worse, once tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, even falsely, an individual can remain marked as a COVID-19 victim for life, depending on the inclination of the responsible authority. Then, irrespective of when and why death occurs, he or she will enter the COVID-19 death register. Thus, the number of coronavirus deaths will continue to soar incessantly. Fear in the general populace is further fueled by reports that SARS-CoV-2 is more dangerous than the flu because it attacks many different organs with probable long-term consequences. Newspapers report and publications abound that the virus can be found in the heart, liver and kidneys. It may even find its way into our central nervous system. Such headlines sound terrifying. However, obtaining positive RT-PCR results for SARS-CoV-2 in organs other than the lungs is nothing surprising. The virus uses receptors to enter our cells that are not only on the surface of lung cells, but two issues are of decisive importance: the actual viral load and the question of whether the viruses cause any damage. The highest SARS-CoV-2 concentration have been found in the lungs of patients. As is to be expected, traces of the virus have been detected in other organs. Most probably they bear no relevance until scientific evidence to the contrary is available. The findings must be left for what they are: trivial observation. Is there a difference between flu? No, it has been known for years that influenza can affect the heart and other organs. All respiratory viruses can find their way into the central nervous system. There is no basic difference with SARS-CoV-2. Once in a while, patients may suffer from long-term consequences. This applies to all viral diseases, and there are exceptions. It is the exception that proves the rule. What do we learn from all of this? COVID-19 is a disease that makes some people sick, proves fatal to a few, and does nothing to the rest. Like any annual flu, of course, it was always necessary to take special care not to bring these agents to elderly persons with pre-existing conditions. When you feel unwell, refrain from visiting grandma and grandpa, especially if they are suffering from heart conditions or lung disease, and whoever has the flu will stay at home anyway. This is how everything has been and how everything should continue. In fact, with SARS-CoV-2 does not constitute a public danger, and that the infection often runs its course without symptoms might have one disadvantage. Perhaps asymptomatic people are contagious and unknowingly pass the virus on to others. This fear originated from a publication co-authored and widely publicised by Drosden, in which he was reported that the Chinese businesswoman who infected an automotive supplier staff member during a visit to Bavaria displayed no symptoms herself. This publication caused a worldwide sensation, with expected effects for a deadly virus that could be transmitted by healthy individuals was akin to a swift and invisible killer. This fear became the driving force behind many extreme preventative measures, from visiting bans for hospitalised patients all the way to obligatory mask wearing. In the midst of general panic, a very important fact escaped general attention. The major statements of the publication turned out to be false. A follow-up inquiry revealed that the Chinese woman had been ill during her stay in Germany and was under medication to relieve pain and reduce fever. This was not mentioned in the publication. Another study that was published in April by the Dresden laboratory also came under international criticism. It concerned the question about the role of the children in disease transmission. According to the Dresden study, asymptomatic children were just as contagious as adults. This message caused great concern to the general public and influenced subsequent decisions by the government. In fact, no studies exist to indicate that children play any significant role as vectors for transmission of this disease. Be that as it may, there was no reason for completely pointless measures like closing schools and daycare centres, which are known to do nothing to protect the high-risk groups, and no reason whatsoever to drive social life and the economy against the wall. What is wrong with Germany and this whole world? Well, all the pictures disseminated so effectively by the international media from Italy, Spain, England, and then even from New York, coupled with model calculation for hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of deaths, planted the firm conviction in the general populace it simply has to be a killer virus. The situation in Italy, Spain, England and the USA, since the end of March, one sensation outdid the next. Italy had the most deaths. The fatality rate shocked us to the core. Spain surpassed Italy in the numbers of infections. The United Kingdom broke the sad European record, exceeded only by the US. The press delighted in spreading as much terrifying news as humanly possible. But let us reflect a little. The impact of an epidemic is dependent not only on the intrinsic properties and deadlines of the pathogen, but also to a very significant extent on how fertile the soil is on which it lands. All reliable figures tell us we are not dealing with a killer virus that will sweep away mankind. So what did happen in these countries from which these dreadful pictures emerged? Detailed answers to these questions must be sought on the ground. Nevertheless, several facts are sufficiently known to warrant mention here. Problems surrounding coronavirus statistics went totally rampant in Italy and Spain. Elsewhere, testing for the virus was generally performed on people with flu-like symptoms and a certain risk of exposure to the virus. At the height of the epidemic in Italy, testing was restricted to severely ill patients upon their admission to the hospital. Illogically, testing was widely performed post-mortem on deceased patients. This resulted in falsely elevated case fatality rates combined with massive underestimates of actual infections. As early as mid-March, the Italian GIMB, Gruppo Italio per la Medicina Basta sulle Evidenze, Italian and evidence-based medicine group foundation, stated that the degree of severity and lethality rate are largely overestimated, with the lethality rate in Lombardy and the Emilia-Romagna region were largely due to overwhelmed hospitals. The fact that no distinction was made between death by and death with coronavirus render the situation hopeless. Almost 96% of COVID-19 deaths in Italian hospitals were patients with pre-existing illnesses. 3/4 suffered from hypertension, more than 1/3 from diabetes. Every third person had a heart condition. As almost everywhere else, the average age was above 80 years of age. The few people under 50 who died also had severe underlying conditions. The inaccurate method of reporting coronavirus deaths naturally spread fear and panic, rendering the general public willingly to accept the irrational and excessive preventative measures installed by governments. These turned out to have a paradoxical effect. The number of regular deaths increased substantially over the number of coronavirus deaths. The Times reported on April the 15th, England and Wales had experienced a record number of deaths in a single week, with 6,000 more than average for this time of year. Only half of those extra numbers could perhaps be attributed to the coronavirus. There was a well-founded concern that the lockdown may have unintentionally but serious consequences for public health. It became increasingly clear that people avoided hospitals even when faced with life-threatening events such as a heart attack because they were afraid of catching the deadly virus. Patients with diabetes or hypertension were no longer properly treated. Tumour patients not adequately tended to. The UK has always had massive problems with its healthcare system, medical infrastructure and a shortage of medical personnel. Due to Brexit, the UK also lacks urgently needed foreign specialists. Many other countries have problems along the same lines. When the influenza epidemic swept over the world in the winter of 2017 and 18, the hospitals in the US were overwhelmed, triage tents were erected, operations were cancelled and patients were sent home. Alabama declared a state of emergency. The situation was little different in Spain, where hospitals just collapsed, and in Italy, where intensive care units in large cities ground to a halt. The Italian healthcare system has been downsizing for years, and the number of intensive care beds is much lower than in other European countries. Furthermore, Italy has the highest number of deaths from hospital-acquired infections and antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the whole of Europe. Also, Italian society is one of the oldest worldwide. Italy has the highest proportion of over 65-year-olds, 22.8% in the European Union. Add to that the fact that there is a large number of people with chronic lung and heart disease, and we have a much greater number in the high-risk groups as compared to other countries. In sum, many independent factors come in together to create a special case for Italy. Since northern Italy was particularly affected, it would be interesting to ask if the environmental factors had an influence on the way things developed there. Northern Italy had been dubbed the China of Europe with regards to its fine particulate pollution. According to the World Health Organization estimate, this caused over 8,000 additional deaths without a virus. In Italy's 13 biggest cities in 2006, air pollution increased the risk of viral pulmonary disease in the very young and in the elderly. Obviously, this factor could generally play a role in accentuating the severity of pulmonary infection. Suspicions have been voiced that vaccinations against various pathogens such as flu, meningococcus and pneumococci can worsen the course of COVID-19. Investigations into this possibility are called for because Italy indeed stands out with its officially imposed extensive vaccination program for the entire population. Yet despite all these facts, the only picture that remains imprinted on our minds are the shocking scenes of long convoys of military vehicles creating away endless numbers of coffins from the northern Italian town of Bergamo. Vice Chairman of the Federal Association of German Undertakers, Ralph Michel, noted, "In Italy, cremations are rather rare. That is why undertakers were overburdened when the government ordered cremations in the course of the coronavirus pandemic. The undertakers were not prepared for that. There were not enough crematoriums and the complete infrastructure was lacking. That is why the military had to help out." And this explains the picture from Bergamo. Not only was there no infrastructure, there was also a shortage of undertakers because so many were in quarantine. And finally, let us examine the United States, where only parts of the country were severely affected. In states like Wyoming, Montana and West Virginia, the number of coronavirus deaths was a 2-digit figure. Worldometer's middle of May 2020. The situation in New York was different. Here, doctors were overwhelmed and did not know which patients to treat first, while in other states, hospitals were eerily empty. New York was a centre of the epidemic, where more than half of the COVID-19 deaths nationwide occurred, date May 2020. Most of the deceased lived in the Bronx. An emergency doctor reported, "These people come way too late," but their reasoning is understandable. They are afraid of being discovered. Most of them are illegal immigrants.